This is Workplace Violence Prevention. My name is Drew. I am an industrial hygienist with the Montana Safety and Health Consultation Group. So industrial hygiene is the health side of health and safety, so I do like sampling for various exposures all around the state, help small businesses stay in compliance. If you have any questions about that, come chat with me after the fact. This training is not very related to what I do for work. This is workplace violence prevention. So background on that is back a few years ago, during COVID, we were just trying to ramp up what we could teach folks at things like this and online safety fests, and what we offer one-off trainings as well. Excuse me. So we found this topic, and I was kind of voluntold to build out this training. I have worked in a lot of different environments over the years. I've tended bar, worked in restaurants, so a lot of my anecdotal stuff is from that kind of a thing. And then I've worked in corporate safety, research and development, chemical safety, and then consultation with the state, where I bounce over all around and do just all sorts of different health and safety stuff now. So we're going to go through several topics here today. This is, as I said, workplace violence prevention. So there's some overarching, just general practices that we'll look at. There's some definitional stuff from OSHA that they put out. Just a couple of pamphlets on what they call late night establishments, which are like casinos, bars, restaurants, convenience stores, liquor stores. Tend to be high crime, high violence industries. And then we also talk about healthcare a lot. Same story. Lots of workplace violence, generally patient on caregiver violence there. So talk about some of those. This is a pretty big group, but if you have any questions as we go, please raise your hand, call out. Either way, try to make this as interactive as possible. They asked me when they were setting this up, is this an hour-long class? I said, it's a little more than an hour. I said, all right, you got 2 hours. It's like, okay, well, I need about 75 to 90 of those minutes, so we'll probably get a little bit early lunch here. I don't think anyone will be too upset about that, but don't get grumpy with me if we cut for lunch and it's not quite lunchtime yet. That's just where we're at. All right, put a disclaimer on there. As I said, I am just a safety guy. This is built from the safety perspective. I used a lot of CDC guidance, NIOSH, OSHA type of stuff. I'm not an HR guy, so a lot of workplace violence stuff is going to come down to HR, making sure that people are fired properly, reprimanded when they have instances of violence that come up. I'm not an HR person, so not the expert there. I've gotten a little bit through osmosis over the years of teaching this, but I still am not an expert in that regard. I'm also not a law enforcement officer, so there's a different perspective there as well. A lot of the de-escalation training and active shooter type trainings will be more of the law enforcement side of things. Got one little video in here from a law enforcement officer who does workplace violence prevention stuff as a career now, but that's basically all of the law that I get into. This is going to be mainly from a safety point of view. All right, so jumping right into some definitions here. Workplace violence is basically any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening behaviors. So basically anytime a person is being made to feel uncomfortable in the workplace, feel like they're at risk of violence, that counts as workplace violence. There are different definitions, different classes that are called out by OSHA and by NIOSH. So they break it out into 4 types in their documentation. Your type 1 is criminal intent. So basically these are things where the business is tangential to the crime. They're there to rob a business, random act of violence. The crime is the motivation. Type 2, on the other hand, has to be based on the customer-client relationship. So that is when you have a disgruntled customer. Again, attended bar a lot of years in my life. When you cut someone off and they're grumpy with you, and they want to fight you because you won't get them another beer, that's your type 2 violence. Type 3 violence is worker on worker. So that is basically a fight that breaks out amongst people on the same job crew. A lot of times in the construction industry, the more blue collar industries, you get more of the worker on worker type of crime. But also you've got instances, the old standard of like a postal worker who comes into work with a gun after a career of working with the post office. That would be a type 3 situation as well. Type 4 is personal relationships that are spilling over into the workplace. So this is like domestic dispute that's happening. Husband and wife are fighting at home, and then they decide the partner comes into the other partner's workplace. They're there for their partner, but then this is happening at work. So that counts as a workplace violence incident. That's a little bit trickier to legislate and litigate when you're on the job side of things. We'll talk about some ways that you can help to prevent those things from becoming more severe as well. I added that bottom bullet point for my own, from my own brain, basically. So there are additional types that aren't called out in the documentation in the pamphlets that they hand out. I just wanted to call out like ideological violence, terrorist threats, things where basically the violence is the point. So a lot of times large-scale active shooter situations are basically essentially a terrorist act. It's not because they're mad at the business. They're there to sow chaos. So I want to call that one out. That's what gets most of the press. That's what you'll see a lot of the larger, the news station stuff is going to be when there's a 20-person active shooter situation as opposed to a one-off fist fight between workers. All right, so there are 3 factors that interact to potentially create a violent interaction in the workplace. So you've got the motivations of the person committing the act. That can be their background, that can be their own psychological inputs, how they're doing that day on their mood, and then the specific one-off things, the second point, the motivations of the inciting event, the background, if they were recently reprimanded at work, if they've got a situation where they might potentially lose their job, that's going to be the inciting event. Those 2 things are only semi-controllable from an employer standpoint. So basically, it's really hard for a boss to make sure that someone's not going to have a bad day, that they're not having problems at home. There are little things you can do to help, but that's not something that the bosses, the employers are going to really focus on. What we're going to focus on in this class is how conducive the workplace is for violence to occur. So we'll go into all the good hierarchy of control stuff. If you've ever taken a safety class, you're familiar with the little pyramid. We'll talk about that, how we can tackle these things, engineering out the possibility, building boxes for people to work from, different work practice rules you can put into place to decrease the likelihood of something bad happening. Some quick workplace violence statistics. So these are a little bit out of date. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics has been drawn back significantly in the last couple of years, so they aren't publishing things quite as regularly as they were prior when I first built this, but the numbers stay pretty steady. Gradual growth with population. We're looking at like 450 to 500 most years. There's been a couple of little spikes up as population's grown, but fatalities over a year, this workplace violence. So from a safety perspective, thousands of folks die in confined space accidents. Thousands of folks die in cave-ins of trenches. A couple hundred people workplace violence homicides aren't that huge of a number, but the reason there's an emphasis on these things is that these are viewed as more preventable. These are a social act. It's not a safety accident that's occurring that's killing people. It's a social act. It's the interaction amongst the people. So we give it a little bit more attention because we feel like it should be more preventable than, say, cave-ins in an excavation. As far as male versus female, fatalities are very highly dominated by men. Right around 80% depending on the year. It was 82 in 2018, and then it dropped down to 81% in 2020 for fatalities. Conversely, I'll talk on the next slide about injuries. Women tend to be much more likely to be injured than men. Men get killed, women get beat up, it seems like. As far as racial demographics go, Caucasian men and women are more likely, 47%, to be a victim of fatalities. The age group, I don't understand this statistical analysis, but they break the groups into working age to 24, 25 to 54, and then 54 to retirement are the 3 big groups. 25 to 54 is obviously the vast majority of all workers. That being said, they also are the vast majority of fatalities, 66%. That dropped down in that age group to 44% in 2020. I think that had to do with who was working which jobs at that point in time. A lot of things were deemed essential versus non-essential, and it just skewed all those statistics in 2020 and 2021. 1 in 5 fatalities are in sales or retail. So again, that's people working things like convenience stores, liquor stores, stuff like that. And then 19% is protective service. So that doesn't include police, but it's all private security, jobs like that. Lots of fatalities in private security as well. All right, so as I was saying, non-fatal injuries. So these are reportable, so basically bad enough that you need stitches, cast, some sort of a hospitalization. These aren't, small scrapes and cuts. These are recordable injuries. we're talking north of 20,000 reportable injuries, depending on the year. Again, very dominated by women when you're looking at the sexes. To my brain, that has to do with healthcare. So women oftentimes work a lot more in healthcare, in the caregiver roles, so nurses, CNAs, docs as well, but a lot of the people who are interacting with the patients day to day end up being women, and then they're the ones that, the more interaction you have with the patients, the more likely you are to get grabbed, hit, whatever, abused in one way or another by the patients. 70% of all injuries were in healthcare, as I've been hinting at. And that bottom bullet there, 21% of injuries resulted in 31 or more days away from work. So that's days away from work. So basically, we're talking 6 weeks of work, 30 days, from a single injury. So that's pretty nasty. That's a pretty bad injury if someone's going to miss, over a month of work. 1 in 5 of these injuries is that severe. So again, just something to keep in the front of your mind that these are pretty serious injuries, pretty serious statistics. I'll try and lighten things up a little bit. This is a little bit dry and rough right here, but I've got some good anecdotes coming down the pike that might be a little bit more fun. Looked at some severe injury data. So severe injuries are things that have to be reported to OSHA within 24 hours. So if someone dies on a job site, you have 8 hours to report it. If someone has an amputation, loses an eye, a severe injury is how they frame it. Then it's within 24 hours you have to report them to OSHA. So these are the real bad injuries, and these were workplace violence related ones. So 325 accounts over a 2-year span. This was a retrospective study that they did, so this isn't all encompassing, this was just with this study. But generally speaking, the severe injuries were a result of hitting, kicking, and beating, not quite half of them. 77 shooting incidents, which is pretty severe, obviously. If you're getting shot and you're not dying, I guess that's a victory, but it's still, shooting accidents. And then 36 cutting or slashing injuries. So those are, again, a lot of healthcare issues there where they grab a scalpel off of the work table and then they're slashing at the nurses around them, end up with real bad lacerations as a result of that sort of a situation. On the money side of things, again, just an insurance study that I read, but they said roughly $130 billion in medical costs and lawsuits and missed work due to workplace violence. This was a nationwide, 10-year study that they did. I think it was 2008 to 2018. And then 53.7 million in losses specific to work loss medic time. So that's, again, nurses, caretakers that have to miss work that then oftentimes are paid out by the institution. So there's a money side of this too. I always tell people, try and be a human, try and worry about the people first, but obviously the bean counters make a lot of decisions, so sometimes you have to use money to justify things. So there's some money stuff for us. All right, as far as compliance goes, so like I said, I work alongside of OSHA. I'm not an OSHA guy, but I work with their laws and their standards, so I have to always tell people, if you've got chemical exposure, you have to have a hazard communication program. If you're going to be exposing yourself to electrical, you have to have a lockout tagout program in place. Make sure that everyone's safe. Follow these standards. It's all numbered out. X, Y, and Z have to be covered. There's not really a standard for workplace violence. They've never built out a, co-part to the respiratory protection standard that is the workplace violence standard. There's no such thing. So OSHA, generally speaking, doesn't really tackle workplace violence all that much. I went through and looked at case studies, again, for the last 10 or 15 years, and I found about 20 instances where OSHA cited, generally speaking, small health clinics, usually rural, just a handful of employees, and the way they would cite them was general duty clause, so that's kind of their catch-all. If we don't have a standard to give it to you, but we're putting people at risk, we're going to call it general duty clause. They cite them under that, and it was almost always a repeat situation where someone got hurt at work, they didn't do anything to correct it and maintain a safe work environment, then they got hurt again. OSHA goes back on the repeat cycle, says, hey, we talked to you about this, you could have done X, Y, and Z, why didn't you fix anything? Well, we didn't have the resources, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we'll cite you for this. And then they're forced legally to make some changes as part of the settlement with OSHA. You can cite record keeping. That's another one that people don't really think of, but all workplace injuries have to go on your OSHA 300 log. Of course, the front of your mind isn't going to be, one of my workers got shot at work, we got to get that on the log. I mean, that's not a sane way to think, but it is a workplace injury. It has to go on the log by the end of the year. If you forget that, they can cite you under those as well. There are nowadays, because of the world we live in, you can get specific workplace violence liability insurance coverage. So basically, it's just an extra form of insurance that you can use to, if something happens, help pay off workers, just give some coverage if you're in a high likelihood of violence scenario. The problem there is, generally speaking, places that are high likelihood of violence, like late night establishments that we're going to talk about, bars and restaurants, they're not looking to get additional supplemental insurance. They are thinking that, it's not going to happen here, so we don't worry about it. It is an option, though, so I'd like to bring that up as well. How are we doing so far? Little dry, I'm aware, but we're going to struggle through here. Going to go into some of the actual workplace violence prevention metrics, how we keep ourselves safe here, and what we can do to build out programs to keep people safe. Here's our pyramid I was talking about before. So generally speaking, you want to be working at the top of the pyramid. So you want to eliminate out your hazards or engineer some sort of a control that keeps people away from the hazards. So this is useful for all hazard assessments. You have, a chemical exposure at your job site. Well, can we get rid of that chemical and use something less hazardous? That would eliminate the problem entirely. If not, then okay, we're going to put the chemicals inside this controlled system. There's a hood to pull the fumes away so people aren't breathing them in. We're in good shape with the chemicals. Take that same mentality and use it for a hazard assessment for workplace violence. So how can we keep the violence from occurring at all, securing people, keep not letting people into different areas of the building, versus doing administrative controls where you keep people isolated, work practices where not everyone's interacting with the public. There's all sorts of things we can do. So I'll talk about a bunch of different options there. And then again, generally speaking, you don't want to rely on PPE to keep people safe. We don't want to just strap everyone with a bulletproof vest and just hope for the best, hope they get hit in the vest, right? You introduce the element of people putting things on wrong, as well as just relying on things that don't always hold up. All right, so some just real general practices that I just kind of rattled off the top of my head that I'd seen both in professional life as well as side job life over the years. You can do things like install alarm systems, panic buttons, have controlled access to various parts of the plant or business. So, keep the customers in one area, workers in the warehouse in the back, and administrative folks in their office space. Don't have to have everyone in every area. That kind of concentrates your risk profile to which areas different people are going to be working in. Perform a hazard assessment. I've got an example hazard assessment at the end of this slide deck for healthcare workers, but basically you just go through and say which parts of our business are most likely to have something occur, and what can we do to protect our folks if that does happen in our establishment. Cite either business or branch specific policies. I tell folks the best idea is to have a zero tolerance policy for any violence. That's not always feasible. Sometimes you go on a construction site and, sometimes people are just kind of jerks and they're going to get loud and rowdy with each other. And every time someone threatens someone that you didn't have that employee anymore, you're not going to have employees for a long time. So you have to cater these things to your specific business, make sure that it's feasible long term, and that you're actually acting on the policies that you create. That's another problem is people write these policies down and then, well, yeah, Greg threatened that guy, but Greg's just a dick. He's having a bad day. Don't worry about it. Well, he's going to know that he can get away with this going forward. So you have to follow the rules that you're setting for your people. You can do things like background checks on new employees. Make sure that employees feel like they can talk with management, that it's an open line of communication. And there have to be two avenues for people to talk as well. If the manager is the aforementioned jerk, then they're not going to go and complain about him to him. So you have to have an HR person, a safety person, someone else that they can go and talk to, so that it's not all reliant on one person getting all of the reports. Lastly there, monitor visitors. So if you have badge into the area, if you have security guards, you have security cameras, any of that stuff can help work to keep an eye on things, make sure that people are aware of their surrounding and the potential problematic scenarios. Some specific engineering controls that are called out in the documentation, as well as just things I've seen out in the world. Reducing blind spots is big for all establishments, but you'll notice that I go back to like gas stations a lot of times, just because that's what I've observed in the world. But you go into most town pumps around the state, either the workers are a little bit higher up, they've got a little step that they're in behind the counter so they can sort of see out over their domain, or there's those bubble mirrors in the corner so they can see around corners, see what's going on. Reduce blind spots so that if something's happening, you have a little bit more warning when someone's coming up to rob you, attack you, what have you. Make sure that exits, parking lots, egress paths are all well lit. That's just a general safe practice that should be for everything, but it works with workplace violence prevention as well. So I worked at a place in Missoula, little bar downtown, for several years when I was going to school the first go around, and yeah, we had our garbage dumpsters were out back in a very dark alleyway. Out front was really well lit, had streetlights and all that, but the back was not. So we had to kind of build out buddy system stuff for bringing out the garbages. It only takes 1 or 2 times of people getting spooked by either other, drunks from other bars or homeless folks that are living out on the streets or what have you. So make some modifications there as well. You can also do structural modifications, so actually building boxes for workers that are dealing with the public. You'll see like kind of bulletproof boxes. Used to think only in the cities, you'd have go into a convenience store and you have to put your money under the little slot to the person because they're inside of a box, but that's crept over into Montana nowadays too. There's a handful of them, especially like the gas stations outside of like a Safeway. They're inside their own little box to keep people away from them. So when we're performing a hazard assessment, like I said, you're doing this for all hazards, right? So you do it for chemical exposure, electrical exposure, unguarded parts, things that can cut you. You do the same exact idea, but when considering the potential for workplace violence. So which part of the job is most likely to interact with the public? Let's say we've got a big warehouse facility type situation. There's a front desk person that's checking in with the customers, they're coming up, then they run to the back to get their orders, they bring it back to them. Obviously the person who's dealing with the public has a lot more exposure than someone who's running a forklift in the back that only sees himself and 2 other warehouse guys every day. So their exposure is a little bit higher than the person in the back. Not necessarily something you'd put on a permanent hazard assessment, but you're paying attention to people's home life and trying to get a sense of if they have some potential for violence spilling into the workplace. Something that you want to keep in the back of your mind too. You're basically doing an impromptu hazard assessment with your colleagues most days. And again, there's a real cynical way to look at all this stuff. You can say, I'm doing X, Y, and Z to keep everybody safe and check the boxes with workplace violence. Again, try to be a human being. Try and take care of people because you care about people. Paying attention to your coworkers, making sure that they're somewhat happy. If they seem like they're generally a pretty happy-go-lucky person and they've been down for the last several days, check in on them. Make sure they're doing okay emotionally. Can help with safety from a workplace violence point of view, but also just makes for a better work environment if people feel like you care about them a little bit. As far as actually calling someone out for something that you think might be an issue, you have to have a reporting structure of some description. So I always say just having an open door policy for all safety concerns with management, both middle management and upper management and or ownership. People should feel comfortable to bring things up if they don't feel like they're safe at work. I run into it again and again, all sorts of different establishments that I go to where, and honestly, from my point of view, the people are probably pretty safe. From their safety staff, they're safe, but the workers don't feel like it, and then they feel like when they bring things to management, they're just being, their words are falling on deaf ears. So want to make sure that people feel heard and that there's a way to document these concerns. Again, there's an insurance aspect to this too. There's CYA in all aspects of all work. So if someone goes and says, hey, I think this guy's a problem, I think he might lash out, and that gets documented and nothing is done about it, you're exposing yourself to some liability there. So it just creates a paper trail to make sure that everyone's covering themselves. Real large establishments, you can do like an emergency hotline, safety concern hotline. I worked at a big tech facility in Idaho. We had like 4,000 or 5,000 people on site. And they were pretty good about open communication with management and higher ups, but also they had the hotline as well. Obviously, if you've got 10 employees, I'm not expecting you to set up a hotline. That's not really feasible for small businesses. But if you've got a real big establishment with some money to spend, sometimes that's a good way to go. So what leads to workplace violence taking place? The biggest one, especially in those class 2 and 3, are termination. So basically people getting fired and not feeling like it was done justly. There are 4 different groups that are called out in the little pamphlet I was working from. So these people are the most likely to lash out in the case of a dismissal. So workplace bullies, these are folks that basically, throw their weight around, get away with most of what they want, and kind of use force of will to get what they want. Once they're fired and they take that power away from them, they're more likely to lash out. Disgruntled employees, of course, can be any category prior to becoming disgruntled, but generally speaking, these people are frustrated with either how things are going, or they get fired and they think, well, I was the only one doing the right thing here, and everyone else was doing the wrong thing, and I still got fired, so they lash out. The other side of that coin is overly attached employees. So you've got like someone who's been at an establishment for 20 years, they feel like work is life, this is all I really have going for me. They lose their job, then that can really turn ugly in a hurry too. That's when you get those real nasty murder-suicide type of plots, active shooter kind of situations, the going postal worker thing that I mentioned earlier. And then nothing left to lose employees, again, can be any of those subgroups, but they just get to the point where they are so mad at what's happened to them, they lost their job, that was all they had going, they're going to lash out and try and make other people feel the pain that they're feeling. So again, with all those, you just try to get to these people before they cross that bridge to nothing left to lose and really lashing out. Try and intercept it before then. I mentioned a zero tolerance policy earlier. Another thing you'll notice about my teaching style is sometimes I forget where I'm at in the slide deck, so we'll bounce a little bit. So zero tolerance policy, like I said, it needs to be established and communicated, and it has to be followed through on. That's the biggest problem, is saying that we have zero tolerance and then we just tolerate. That's not going to work for anybody. Yep, hit on all those bullets already, I think. And with everything safety related, this will come up again and again and again. Everything has to be trained. Everything has to be documented. If you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. And people have to be retrained, usually annually, on all this stuff. If you didn't write it down and people are willing to say that they didn't get trained on it, then OSHA is going to say, well, you can't prove it, so they didn't get the training that you're pretending you gave them. All right, so work practices, these are things that are not at the lowest level, that PPE level, they're the second tier, so preferable to PPE, but not as good as eliminating a hazard altogether. But these are some things you can do to try to limit exposure once again. Again, things that you'll see once you start paying attention. Go into a town pump or like a pharmacy, you'll see little stickers on the windows that say, we keep less than $100 in the till after 10 o'clock. It ain't worth it to rob us. Don't bother. Is basically what that sticker means. In pharmacies, they'll say, we have all narcotics are kept in a time-release safe. We can only get you 3 pills. Again, it's not worth it. Don't bother. These are just signs that are going up, but they can help to plant the seed to get people to not go through with any of these acts. You can increase staffing during problem times. This is a feasibility problem. Again, working in bars and restaurants, generally speaking, at the end of the night, that's the slowest part of the night. You don't want to keep people around just because, so you've got to figure out some sort of a middle ground. We had, as I said, we had the kind of problematic garbage situation through the alley out back, and we'd cut servers as the night went on. We always had 1 or 2 bartenders and then like 5 servers. By the end of the night, you had 1 bartender, 1 server. Before we got down to 1 and 1, I instituted the rule that everyone had to start taking they had to do their garbage runs and basically get the place ready to close while there were still extra servers on. So you could have an extra person going out into the alley, so people weren't running solo. And that way, we could still cut people as they weren't needed, but most of the work was done, so you didn't have, 1 bartender and 1 server going out at 3 a.m. with hundreds of dollars in tips in their pockets, and just kind of putting themselves at risk, basically. Work practices, so that's what I just described, basically putting the buddy system into place for certain tasks. There's all sorts of different ways to tackle that as well. And then the bottom point there really depends on where you are. I live in Butte now, and I re-retired from bartending again back in December, but give me a few months, I'll probably go back again. I worked at a little neighborhood bar for several years, for the last 4 years, and Butte, as anyone from around here knows, has a little bit of a reputation. You can find a fight in most bars in Butte. You can find a fight with a bartender in a lot of bars in Butte. Jim's, thankfully for me, was not that kind of place. Never drank on the job. Bartenders usually had cooler heads and could, and the cops all knew that. So we had good relationships with the police. They'd come in and say, hey, what's the deal? What's going on? And know that I wasn't instigating the problem. You go into some bars around town, again, the bartender might be more of a problem than the drunk patron. So having a good relationship with the police can be very valuable. Sometimes less so, just depends on where you are and what the department's like. But it's an idea to plant as well. Make sure that the cops know that we're doing things the right way. We're trying to keep people safe, and if something happens, they know that you weren't part of the problem. So emergency action plans are a requirement for all establishments. If you have more than 10 employees, you have to have a written version of it and train folks on it. Less than that, you can just do it verbally. But an emergency action plan is, generally speaking, just like your fire drills, maybe an earthquake drill. But the way the law is written is any foreseeable emergency situation has to be accounted for in the emergency action plan. And unfortunately, workplace violence is a pretty reasonably anticipated thing. I've had real angry customers a whole lot more times than I've ever had to deal with earthquakes, for instance. So adding these to your EAP, having some workplace violence prevention stuff in there to say, okay, if we've got someone comes on site with a gun, this is where we go. We have a mustering point just like we would for a fire situation, evacuation, any of that. Just account for these, make a plan, and try to stick to that plan and train for it. Active shooter training falls into that same envelope. Not my realm, but some local police departments will give them. I know it's been hard lately, largely as an insurance thing, to get active shooter training, but I know that there are still a handful of local police departments around the state that will do them, and you can hire out contractors too, but there's just been some lawsuits over the years that's made it more difficult, so I know that's not the easiest thing to get done if you're looking for active shooter training. I don't think we're doing one at Safety Fest for that exact reason. We tried to get one and couldn't get it done. So should you, heaven forbid, have a workplace violence event in your facility or at your job site, you have to do follow-up investigation just like you would for any other injury. So basically, if you have a first report of injury, insurance form, or like a 5Y investigation, any sort of fishbone analysis, hazard investigation, any of that sort of stuff, do the same thing as you would. Again, I've got an example of this at the end for healthcare folks. But you're basically going to go through and say, hey, what could we have done to have prevented this? Is there anything that we can put into place now, make sure that this isn't going to happen again going forward? Should we have seen any red flags here? Was there a history of the violent person making threats that we should have taken more seriously? Document all this stuff and make sure that you communicate it out. You should follow up with the victims after something happens. Again, try and be a human being to your workers. There's psychological implications. PTSD is very, very real. I apologize if anyone's taken this class before. I tell this story almost every time, but have a friend who tended bar in Butte as well. He was a Special Forces Army Ranger guy who tended bar in between deployments, had been overseas 10 times. He's in his mid-30s at this point. Real tough guy, real intense dude. Broke up a fight over a pool game in his bar, sent the guys out the front and back door. Guy went out the back door, went to his car, got his gun, came back in. Guy that he was fighting with was gone, so he decided that the bartender was his enemy. I think emptied his clip at the bar at my buddy, who saw the gun, knew what was happening, dove for cover, got out of the way, counted the bullets because he's a crazy military dude and that's how his brain works. Knew his clip was empty, jumped up, tackled him, kicked the gun away, held him until the cops got there. Again, pretty good outcome, all things considered, but the guy I know ended up quitting the job like a month later. He said he played it off. No big deal. I've been shot at before. I'll be shot at again. It's all good. But I'm projecting a little bit here. I'm not a psychologist, but it sure seemed like some PTSD presented, and him going to work, that he was just reliving that moment. He wasn't worth it for $150 in tips a night or whatever. So he quit that job, and that's one thing for a bartender. But if you got psychological problems, long-term issues with PTSD affecting your career, that's going to be a lot more significant than a 2-night-a-week bartending job. So follow up with your folks, make sure that they're okay, and also that they can still do their jobs. There's some performance issues here that, again, if you want to be cynical, from a business side of things, the people can't do their jobs and they're not as valuable as an employee, so it works both ways. I think I've got a short video here. We're going to see if she wants to work for me. Do you have any noise? Huh. We're going to go ahead and skip that one. So, got no audio, so that doesn't do us any good. I'll just give you a quick version of it. That fella is a retired cop, and he now does active shooter response training and goes on news after things happen, and just talks a lot about the same things that I was just discussing. Look in here. There we go. So he walks through just there was an active shooter scenario in Houston, and he talks about they ended up killing that shooter, and I think there were 2 wounded but no fatalities. So from his perspective, it was a success. Less so for the people who were shot, but just depends on point of view, I guess. Quick little subsection here. So state of Montana started collecting some data. They did a long-term retrospective study looking at public employees. So public employees are government workers, a lot of us in this room, people who work at like the state hospitals, educators, schools, the state-sponsored pre-K, daycare, that sort of thing. They were just looking at workplace violence injuries in those areas because they don't have the same reporting requirements as private businesses do with OSHA. So they were going back in the data, basically 17,000 incidents over the 20-year span, just looking at growth over time, basically 2 to 3% year to year in these injuries. Back in 2023, the legislature actually made it a requirement that these people start making, have record-keeping rules, so they had to start reporting this data into the system. So the data should get more robust. We had 1 cycle of data that I think is in the next slide. And then as time goes on, we'll just have more and more to look at, try to get a sense of, again, what we can do to protect some people, see who's getting hurt where, and what issues they're running into. So basically, there were, in that first cycle of injuries that were logged in 2023, there were over 1,000 workplace injuries from workplace violence. The vast majority of them were caretakers, so people in childcare, education, and healthcare were the ones that were getting injured. And it was largely people taking care of little kids and elderly folks, which kind of makes sense if you think about it, but daycare workers get beaten up by those little kids, bitten, slashed, cut, all sorts of stuff. And then people taking care of old folks, senior citizen cares, and especially mental health, dementia wards, Alzheimer's, stuff like that. They get hammered as well. One of the main things that jumped out to me is these almost never get paid out for workers' comp. Only 2.8% of these cases resulted in any sort of workers' comp payout. So basically all these folks are just treating this like, this is part of the job. Yeah, sure, my arm hurts and it's hurt for a week because I got my shoulder wrenched, but it's all good. I'll go back out and do it again tomorrow. Try to slowly change our brains about that, to not view these things as acceptable just because it's part of the job. And that's a big chunk of the healthcare section that we're going to be getting into here in a few. So late night establishments I've already talked about, and again, this is kind of my accidental area of expertise just from having side jobs. But basically, late night establishments are a focus because they are cash heavy. A lot of times there's alcohol involved, really high rates of injuries, and an outsized number of fatalities given the number of employees that work in these places. Again, just robberies gone bad a lot of the time. Also, it's usually 1 employee on site. You go into a 24-hour casino. There's 1 casino runner in there at 2 or 3 a.m. And I don't know how much you ladies, for instance, are going into a Lucky Lowe's at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday. Not the best crowd, usually speaking. Little dicey. So I always feel for those workers. And again, we've got just an attitude of acceptance. So usually management and even the workers just say, yeah, it happened. We called the cops. The cops came, made a report. Person may or may not get caught down the line. And that's just kind of the end of things. And again, I'm just trying to encourage people to look at it as something internal that can be done as well. Well, can we learn some lessons? Can we do something to keep people safer going forward? Can we, isolate folks, keep them away from potentially hazardous situations, whatever we can do. So a couple of ideas on what we can do to keep people safe in these late night establishments. Any kind of de-escalation training is super valuable. I will take a seasoned 10-year bartender, casino runner, over pretty much anyone in the world as far as talking people down. They are very good at dealing with disgruntled, pardon the phrasing, but tweakers in a casino late night that are real agitated, or people who are drunk. Generally speaking, people who've been dealing with that for a lot of their career, they know how to talk people down. So lean on those people. Get your training in-house. Say, when someone's green, coming on, 20-year-old college kid like myself going into work in a bar, put me with the 40-year-old bartender who's been doing this for 15 years, and they're going to have a lot of good advice on how to de-escalate situations, keep things from getting too out of hand. Build work rules to decrease potential for robbery or other crime. Already talked about doing, buddy system when you're running things outside where there's chances for problems. Doing money drops, not keeping thousands of dollars in the safe late night, or in the register rather. Put it in the safe to keep that exposure limited. Putting resources to having extra people on staff for the problematic times, again, not always feasible, but when you can, or modifying the rules like I was saying with our garbage example. Just change practices to where it doesn't actually take more money, but it keeps people a little bit less in hazardous situations. You can do engineering controls, basically put a wall, put a wide bar, something in place to keep people from being as exposed to the potentially hazardous situations. So just found some pictures online, but there's a plexiglass wall. A lot of times when places have like cigarettes or pouches or whatever, or liquor, a lot of times it'll go in there, keeps people from stealing things for one thing, and also keeps the employees away from the people who might want to rob them. And then deep bars are super popular nowadays. It's an aesthetic thing. It's not for workplace violence prevention. No one's consulting their architect on how to keep workplace violence limited. But it does have a benefit of, if I'm working at a bar and my bar is this deep, that means my customer is right there, which means he can grab me and I can grab him. If I've got a 4-foot deep bar, less likely to get grabbed onto. This gives you a little bit more of a buffer, and they look nice, so it works out. All right. Last chunk here is healthcare setting specific stuff. So why do healthcare settings get so much attention? Because again, they just get hammered, just get assaulted constantly. There's some statistics on the next couple slides. It's kind of mind blowing when you look at it and think about it. These are high stress environments, both for the workers and for the patients and for the families of patients. There are a lot of small clinics that don't have the staffing, don't have additional hands to keep small problems small. They just, as things escalate, they get worse and worse. If you've only got one home health care nurse or home health social worker in with a client, and that client's having a bad day, there's a lot more potential for things going bad than if you had 5 staff and 1 patient. So it's a numbers game there. Mental health facilities are a big contributor to the statistics here. They actually have an OSHA emphasis program specific to mental health, workplace violence prevention in mental health care facilities. So ours is public. Warm Springs is a public hospital, but there are lots of private mental health facilities, rehab facilities, inpatient and outpatient rehab facilities have really high rates of workplace violence as well. Again, just brain chemistry, whether things are fried and not firing quite the right way to begin with, or you've got substances modifying the way a brain works, both of those are going to increase your likelihood of having problems. 20% of all workplace injuries related to workplace violence. So 1 in 5 of all injuries for workplace violence happen to healthcare workers. So again, just really outsized on the injury side of things, if not the fatality side. A couple quick statistics. So 75% of all workplace assaults happen in healthcare. So again, even more than that 20% of all injuries, the assaults specifically, it's 3 and 4. 100% of ER nurses said that at some time in the last year they had something violent happen to them. So every single person surveyed on this specific survey said that they had experienced something. 59% of nursing aides said that they had something happen in the last week, and 16% in the last day. So again, just 1 in 6 CNAs are saying that it's happening to them every single day. Something bad's going to happen. And 46% of all nurses, of all CNAs, experience some sort of violence in their last 5 shifts. So usually they work longer days, so a lot of times it's 5 shifts in 2 weeks, so basically a pay period. Half the time, something's going to happen each pay period to a nurse. Again, going to tackle it with the triangle like we did before. So we want to engineer out these issues first. Something that you'll notice if you again, start teaching this class and then go back to it a dozen times over 5 years. You'll start to pay attention to things you might not have before. But new hospitals oftentimes are kind of built in a honeycomb floor pattern. So you've got a central nursing station and then branches out in all directions for the halls. And that's a function of being able to get to patients faster, so you can have 10-second response time as opposed to going all the way to the end of the hall and it taking 20 seconds to get to the patient. But that also has the benefit of if someone grabs a patient and is holding them there, they can have help within 10 seconds as opposed to, again, waiting 20 or 30 seconds. Anybody watching The Pit? There was a real nasty episode in this season where one of the new nurses got grabbed by a coked up jerk golf player guy. Anyway, it creeps into pop culture. As far as administrative tasks we can look at, so training, workplace violence, toolbox talks, just trying to make this, again, something that is in the front of people's minds and try to get the nurses, CNAs, healthcare workers to not think that this is just something that's going to happen to them that's acceptable. Try and change that mentality to make people be more safe in their job roles. You can do a analysis and basically a retrospective look at where issues are occurring, and that can help focus some of your financial resources or manpower resources to prevent those things. There's a cool table here at the end that kind of goes through different job roles, job titles, and the areas where incidents happened. And you can, it makes logical sense, but you can sort of pick out when people are alone, when people are at meal times, people are grumpy when they're hungry. A lot of times that's when the violence occurs. Another video that probably won't work, so we'll just leave that guy out for now. I'll come back to it in a minute and see. Actually, let's just see what we got. I had audio before we started today, but then we hooked in for the camera and I think we killed it. So that one is another video, and if you guys are, I guess I can use my microphone. If you guys are at all interested in these, I'm happy to shoot you over a link to any of this stuff. That one is, it's a bunch of nurses in Australia. Our problems are not necessarily unique. I have the exact same problems for healthcare workers in Australia, and it's just a long series of short stories and issues that women have had. They're largely female nurses in that video. Worth your 5 to 10 minutes if you have them, but we don't have any audio, so I'm not going to make us sit through a quiet video and guess what they're saying. Here's a records review thing that I was describing. So they go through and just basically break out where in the hospital or which style of non-hospital sort of a treatment center we're dealing with, and then where the problems are occurring. And then the next slide has a whole lot more data in it, but you can already see kitchen area seems to be a problem area, dining area, nurse's station comes up again and again. And then this one goes through job titles and activities that were done when the incident occurred. So once again, you'll see nurse, nurse, nurse. Therapy room comes up again and again. Social workers come up again and again. Time of day is, again, late night and meal time seems to be when people are most grumpy, most likely to lash out. Again, you get woken up at 4 in the morning for a blood draw. I understand being grumpy about that too. So those are the times when people are likely to get hit or grabbed or what have you. All right. Additional tasks. You can perform JHAs, so job hazard analyses, just like, as I've said before, just like you would for any hazardous situation. Just treat your workplace violence just like any other hazardous situation. Do a JHA for it as opposed to the risk assessments we talked about earlier. It all kind of goes into the same pot. You can conduct employee surveys, so try and get a sense of what people feel like their exposures are. A lot of times the safety guy or HR person or managers aren't seeing the same stuff as the workers are on the floor. So they might have more input there that can help you figure out what your problem areas are and focus on those. Client or patient services, a lot of times, especially in healthcare, they've got a special designation that those folks are the ones that go, sometimes they're social worker types that go and help with families that are bereaved, that are having a hard time, loved one that they're losing, what have you. They have a lot of valuable input as well, and their job is basically de-escalation and helping people get through rough times. So if you have those resources, lean on those as well. Boy, I wasn't kidding. I thought we'd go at least an hour 15. Without my videos, we're an hour. Here's my resources if you ever want to read any of this stuff. Late Night Establishment, if you just search OSHA 3153, you'll get that one. Same for the healthcare, OSHA 3148. And then this link here, again, if you guys have any questions, I think my contact info is coming up here. Shoot me an email or call or text and I can send you these slides or these links. I'm happy to get those over to you.